You know the Tower of Babel? That old religious parable from the book of Genesis? It's this old story sort of meant to explain the existence and I guess the creation of different languages and cultures. I guess sort of an abridged version of it would be there were a bunch of people, right? And these people all spoke the same language. And they knew that God, the old man in the sky with a big flowy beard, or however you imagine your God to be, was up in the sky, right? They knew the heavens were up there, and they wanted to go. Obviously, it sounds pretty nice, right? So they came up with this plan to make this tower that would go all the way up into the sky. You know, they didn't have airplanes back then. They couldn't just fly and shoot right on up. So they decided they were going to build this tower, right? This Tower of Babel. So they had all these people working together. Had construction workers, stonemasons, carpenters, woodworkers, architects, whoever, right? And they're all working in unison to build this tower to go all the way up to the top. So one day God thinks to himself, they're getting kind of close here, right? We need to make sure that does not happen. So God decided that all these people are going to speak different languages now. You know, they're going to have different cultures, different languages. And pretty soon, you know, before everything was working pretty nicely, you know, they're all helping each other out. But then, after all this sort of happened, someone would go to sort of put a wall up, right? They need a brick. So they would ask for a brick, and instead they get, you know, a bucket of water. Or someone's building a staircase, you know, they needed a hammer. So they'd ask for a hammer, and instead the guy gives them a lizard, you know. And pretty soon this led to a lot of arguments. You know, if you ask for a brick and you get a bucket of water, you're probably not going to be all too happy, right? So, needless to say, the tower did not get finished. You know, all these arguments broke out, and then, you know, eventually they all went on their merry way, and they came up with their own cultures. They had all these different languages, right? And they formed their own groups and whatnot, but the Tower of Babel never got finished, you know? And what I got from the story when I first heard it wasn't necessarily, I guess, the despair of the tower or the fact that, you know, man should not attempt to be above God, you know, but what I realized, it sort of implanted this idea to me, you know, that the act of, say, opening your mouth, talking, or trying to communicate and having no one hear you at all is its own sort of little type of exile in a way, you know. I believe it was Wittgenstein who said, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world," something around that. You know, to lose a shared language is then to lose a shared world. That's why when you learn another language, I'm sure you've seen those videos where someone will go up and they'll be like, "Hey, I can speak your language," or they go to order food, you know, in that person's native language, and the entire interaction is completely different. You know, it's sort of like you're unlocking like this brand new area when you learn a different language. It's a whole new world. You know, if you've ever played RuneScape before, it's like becoming a member for the first time and you unlock all these new areas. It's kind of like that. It's kind of the same thing if you think about it, you know. And without it, you know, without, I guess, language, shared language, you know, we start shrinking back, I guess, into this sense of isolation. It's just based on what we know. There's all these different cultures and worlds out there that are completely foreign and completely alien to us, you know. And it's like little dots on a map just full of just misunderstanding. You know, now when words lose their meaning, you know, even when we're speaking the same language, you know, I'm sure you've experienced that before when, you know, you're saying something, you're talking to someone, and for whatever reason, or maybe it goes the other way back to you, you know, they're saying something, you just, for life, you cannot understand what they are talking about. You know, I think when that happens, society starts to go a little crazy. You know, society just starts to lose its bearings. And language, I think, is humanity's first great invention. Forget fire. I guess that wasn't really an invention, but the discovery of fire, forget about it. Or like the wheel, that's an invention, right? The wheel, bronze tools, bronze weapons, all that. None of it shines a light to language. Language gave us something that nothing else could. It allowed us to share what we had, inside of us. Back then, way back when we learned to communicate, you could tell your neighbor, that a dinosaur came in and ate your brother. You could explain that to someone. You couldn't really do that without communication, without language. And we couldn't finally, after the creation of language, I suppose, we could explain what we wanted, what we feared, what we desired, the whole nine. Language allowed us to plan, imagine, promise, and it led to, I guess if you break it all the way down, it's sort of the foundation of our civilization, right? Of any civilization. The birth of language could very well then be, I suppose, the birth of creation. What are we if not communicators, right? It was the dawn of our shared reality. Now, don't get too comfortable here. We're gonna regress a little bit, because just as language, can build, it can also decay. It has the power, the almighty power, right, to destroy. I think as George Orwell of 1984 and Big Brother fame said when he was talking about the English language, in particular in politics, that sloppy and dishonest language doesn't reflect, lazy thought, it breeds it. It has the power to corrupt, the mind itself. And I don't think you can really take, I suppose, silence as the opposition to language, since the death of language in general is going to be anything but quiet. It's just going to be noise. It's going to be a lot of noise, just sort of masquerading itself as communication, as communicating. It's just more and more and more that means less and less and less. And the birth of language, right? We were building civilization, we were building towers. And the death of language, all of it can be taken down without lifting a single finger, right? Now, I don't think there's anywhere else where I've seen this more prevalent than in corporate America. And now I don't want to sound too ungrateful here, since I do feel quite blessed that I have a job, But there are days where it feels very much so like it's Babel all over again. It's the creation of the tower, I guess the not completion of the tower. How is it that everyone in the same room, speaking the same exact language, yet somehow still absolutely no one understands each other? Nobody actually communicates. How many more times, can I say, we need to leverage our synergies here, into insightful actions to better promote resource allocation in order to achieve unilateral growth across all verticals, and then finish it up, by saying, now let's take this offline and circle back. What the hell does that even mean? It's just random buzzwords sort of daisy chained together, where there's no ownership at all. It's just firewall after firewall of just random words, with the corporate buzzwords. And eventually, whenever that project collapses or falls short or comes in late, whatever it is, and then everyone starts, pointing at each other, because no one ever talks, directly, right? And I suppose extending it further, we have social media, and all these different platforms that were sort of supposed to foster connection and communication, right? But I think oftentimes it can lead, at least from what I've seen, to a lot of alienation, and it's people, hiding behind, just throwing stuff out just for the sake of it, right? And instead, all of this, what meant to be all these platforms for connection and communication, it's sort of like Hank Moody in Californication said, it just seems to me that it's just a bunch of stupid people, communicating with a bunch of other stupid people in this, proto-language that resembles more of what the cavemen used to speak than the King's English, and that's definitely not always the case, but sometimes it feels like we're stumbling back, to Babel, parable or not. It's not just about the past. It's getting to a point where the idea is getting kind of awfully close, I think, to what we're evolving, or I suppose devolving to. The birth of language was the birth of connection. The death of language is returned back to that isolation. Between those 2 points there, that's sort of where we live right now. Civilization isn't held together by steel or stone or wood. All that came later. It's the sentences, and talking or communicating with one another that got us there to begin with. You lose that, and the towers just fall again. And yeah, well, we're all doing our part here. I don't want to get too ranty here, but yeah. All right. You have yourself a good rest of your morning or afternoon or night, whatever it is. I'll talk to you in the next one.